As you can see, as I've already mentioned, Vicky Patel, our new NQICAN chair, she's unable to join the call at the moment, but she will give us an overview around NQICAN and who we are when she is able to. But today's session is all around the use of infographics and using infographics in clinical audit and other quality improvement work. And as the former chair of NQICAN for the last 6 years, one of the pieces of work that we wanted to champion across our networks is the importance of using infographics to get messages out, because in current times there's a lot of competing priorities in terms of getting people's attention. So what we're trying to do is help people with the tools that are available to us, and also sharing case studies from colleagues that are already using infographics across our network, giving us some examples this morning. So I'll start my introduction. So my day job is the clinical audit manager at University Hospitals of Leicester, and we've been using infographics through different ways over the last several years, and I've got some examples about that, about how we use that within our trust. But actually, before I go into that detail, I just thought it'd be quite important to actually think about what is actually an infographic. And I've done quite a bit of research into this, and the best definition in terms of relevant to our audience that I found is actually infographics are graphic visual representations of information, data or knowledge, intended to present information quickly and clearly to tell a story about the message that you're trying to get over. And as we can all understand, we do in healthcare. Most of us on the call will be dealing in healthcare. We live in a complex industry, and we work in a complex industry. So getting out messages in a simplistic way is quite difficult, and it's quite a challenge. So the use of infographics to get out key messages has certainly been something that I've found very useful to use, and the world of industry, full stop, uses infographics a lot, and it's around us all the while, whether we know them as infographics or not. So a different way of looking at infographics, and I found this nice infographic of a infographic, if you like, on Twitter, is that if you like, the data is all of the Lego bricks. What we can do with all of that data is sort it out so that it's in an order, and then we start rearranging it to make sense in terms of that order, and then think about how we wanted to present that visually to tell what the data is saying, and then under all of that we want to make sure that we need to get a story behind what our audience actually wants to tell. This one is not relevant to us in terms of the healthcare setting, but actually you can see that quite nicely, the complex world we live in healthcare, there's lots of data. So what we need to do is sort it, arrange it in terms of, in a clinical audit context, how are we doing against our standards, present it in a table or a chart or a bar chart, and then you say our story is, in a way, how are we doing against those standards, what do we need to improve, and try and bring to life the data that we're presenting. And I think before we go too much into the infographics, one of the most important things is actually about making numbers count. And one of the things that's most important to that is actually the curse of knowledge. And recently I've come across this book called Making Numbers Count, and I found it really interesting. I've actually ordered a copy that should have arrived yesterday, but it hasn't. But I've seen a few lectures from the author of this, and he's got a very good way of saying around how we spend a lot of time analysing data and reporting on data, but actually we don't think about how we want to get the messages that we've got in terms of translating that into the real world. And sometimes the curse of knowledge is actually, as you're the expert, you're very deep into the subject matter that you're looking at. You've been living and breathing the data that you've collected and analysed. So sometimes it's hard to know what other people don't know, and sometimes you leave out really key key bits of the information. So and one of the things Chip was saying is that nobody's a natural at numbers. You quite often say to people, are you a natural at numbers or not? Or some people are more natural literally or with language, but actually the human mind can deal with numbers up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 naturally. And then beyond that, 6 to infinity, we all struggle in terms of how we deal with those numbers. So actually, it's quite important to realise that from the off. And the more simplistic we can present our data, the better that we can get across our stories. And what Chip was saying is that actually, to help with motivation and getting people to act on the data, we do need to make the data touch emotionally with people and make it into the real world, because sometimes when we talk about percentages or trends, people actually misunderstand. And what does that mean to my patients? How does that mean to the care in terms of what we've got to try and do? And he is slightly, he was trying to make it simplistic. It's talking convert to process is a little bit jargonistic, but the example he gave to me, and it's very resonant, as I've been on a diet in 2022 so far. He was saying you could say 4 grams of sugar in a drink doesn't mean too much to me, but actually if you say that's the equivalent of 3 donuts, you can actually see then that that's actually a lot of sugar in that drink. So actually, if you equate it to something that people can resonate with and actually tap into, then you're much more likely to get your point over. And one of the things that I took away certainly was when we're being analysts of a project, is that perhaps 2/3 of the time should be spent in terms of getting the answer, and then the final third needs to be planning of how we share that answer and make people actually resonate with that data. Another good example of presenting data that resonated with myself was these emotional measuring sticks, which if you look at a standard way, because this certainly got my attention, is that a standard way of presenting is to say livestock are responsible for 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that sounds quite large when I think about it, because I hadn't really thought about it too much before. But obviously, as we talk about sustainability and making things neutral, if you look at this a different way, he said if cows were an actual country, they would be the 3rd highest producer of greenhouse gases of all nations. And actually, the cow nation surpasses every country combined in the EU together, and they would only lag behind China and America. So that to me really made me sit up and notice that actually there is a lot of global greenhouse gases emissions coming from our livestock. So as with all of our networks sessions, we sort of like signpost people to resources that we found useful. So the books there are available for £9.99 at all good bookstores, but you can actually view the lecture, and I think you'll probably get that's there for free if you wanted to understand it. And what Chip mentioned, and obviously as clinical auditors, one of our flying ambassadors is Florence Nightingale, and actually she used infographics in the Crimean War and was able to try and make sure that people understood the severity of what we were dealing with in terms of mortality, and use infographics such as the one on the screen to actually diagnose where the problems were and try and take it forward. And certainly, as we know, that's over nearly 200 years old. So there's certainly not a new concept, infographics. And I think why infographics work, well, actually because our brain works in different ways, but ultimately 50% of our brain is dictated to the actual visual functions that we see. And we process images much faster than we do text. So ironically, I made this a texty field because you probably won't be able to take this in as well as you'd like. But if I had a nice infographic like the previous one, then you can actually make that, take it into your brain sort of thing. So And again, in terms of gold standard, this is what we're talking about for clinical audits. This is the cystic fibrosis National Registry, but they do an annual at a glance report that looks at presenting all of their key findings from a very detailed report, which I imagine not a lot of people will read from start to finish, especially the general public and patients, etc. So if you get a nice infographic like this, then that's certainly something that we should be aiming for as best practice, and that's what we've got colleagues sharing this morning. Just a few slides in terms of my own experience from Leicester. When I first took over as clinical audit manager, this is what our annual report might atypically look like, because there's lots of work going on within our trust in terms of improvement work. And you can see there that it wasn't actually this big, but I'm just using that for effect to tap into your visual senses. But ultimately, I realised that not a lot of people have got a lot of time to read all of that detail. So what we did was actually speak to our comms team and say, could you help us with redesigning our annual report? And they were experts in terms of is someone letting people in? I've got an alert there just to letting people in the lobby. Hopefully Becca's onto that. Thank you. And actually then we presented that, and it was really successful, and suddenly a lot of people started asking questions about, well, we didn't realise you did that, and actually that's really interesting. I didn't realise clinical audit was all about quality improvement, etc. So and we've continued to do annual or biannual reports within our team to actually demonstrate what we do as a team, but also what we're planning to do as a priority for the coming year. We've used lots of different infographics in different ways, and again, I won't spend time on that because I know we've got colleagues joining today to share their experiences of their individual ones, but there are lots of different ones. And again, this is we've used infographics for our annual improvement awards, and that's in the public domain. So when we share the slides afterwards, you'll be able to click on that and see some of the examples that we've got within Leicester in the public domain. And again, this is what we did as part of Clinical Audit Awareness Week with our East Midlands training department for emergency medicine. And they used this sort of infographic to try and make, it's called Lightning Learning. They have this concept for all learning subjects across emergency medicine, and we did one for clinical audit, which went down very well. So in terms of the different types of media we can use infographics in, atypically an infographic per se is a long continuous scrolling item with detail that you can that are built for tablets and mobiles, but they're not just for those. That you can use them in presentations and slides, reports, posters, dashboards, newsletters, and social media and the like. And again, it's all around trying to get your messages out in terms of what have you found from your project, what do we need people to be aware of, what do we need people to do, and what we need to try and avoid is death by PowerPoint. Far too many audit presentations and improvement projects have got far too much detail. We need to make it nice and concise. What are the key messages? Quite often meetings are too long where we can't read all of the papers, and you can't see the wood for the trees, etc. And we have data overload. And again, we're trying to, as a community, we're trying to sort of ditch the RAG rating and move for runtime charts for improvement data. And again, runtime charts is a good way of getting over a complex story and telling a story when you annotate it. So my tips for producing your own infographics is have a go. Don't be afraid of it and start using them today if you haven't already. An infographic can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. And there's lots of good templates out there. So if you've got no software to use, etc., then use another template, use Excel, use PowerPoint. In 365, there's lots of templates ready-made for infographics in PowerPoint and Excel now. So you don't need to have expensive software to do this. There is a bit of a skill about choosing what font you use, and that's called typography. And again, I've not got enough time to cover that this morning, but I've done a link here to a nice open blog that talked around the power of the different fonts that you can use. So have a think about how the fonts look. You don't want to use fonts that are not making it clear. And as I say, use what expertise you've got within your organisation. The graphics department and the comms team are very trained in doing this type of work. So work with them as a team. And when you've got your end graphic, put yourself in the shoes of people who are going to be viewing your infographics, because it's nothing like people who are totally nothing to do with what you've been doing. Can they understand what are the results showing? What do I need to do going forward? And then when you've cracked it, share it, and then get it out there in as many different ways as you can, because there's lots of ways now that people can get information, and those listed on there are some of the ones that we've used both in my trust and as a network as NQI can. So